Alrighty, everyone. Let's see. Everything is turned on. We're good to go. So we wanted to come this morning together. I just want to share some ideas. For those who are on the video, I'm holding up a copy of Rocco Errico's book, and it's called Setting a Trap for God. And in this book, Rocco Errico, Rocco's ministry, what his work is all about, is helping us in the 20th and the 21st century Western world of America, helping us to really understand the culture and the language and kind of the context, if you will, that the New Testament scriptures and the Old Testament scriptures, as we call them, the Bible as it's called in this country, to understand where it comes from. And I'll tell you why this is so important. You know, there's so many ways to say something. There's so many ways to use a word. And in the language of the Aramaic language that was spoken in Palestine at the time that Jesus was there were only about 4,000 words. And people didn't necessarily read or write. That was not literacy was not a big skill. You know, the business people, the business class, and the scholars, they were able to read and write. But the ordinary person didn't read nor write. And they learned orally. The stories were told in such a way that there was poetry, there was alliteration, there was humor, there was all these kind of techniques that a teacher uses to paint a picture for a student. You know, the parable that kind of gives you the image. Remember Aesop's fables and sour grapes. You can't get the idea of the fox jumping up at the grapes and not quite able to reach them. That picture stays with you. And this is the way that teachers in those days taught, because there wasn't a means to write things down that was cost effective. There wasn't a need to do it because people couldn't read. So if you take a language that only has 4,000 words, you can see that each word had to have multiple meanings. And the way that we extract what a particular usage of a word means is from the setting, from the context, you know, from where the story is being told, what else is going on in the story, what is the inflection in the voice of the person speaking, you know. If you make a statement, and I approve of it, you know, and like I'm agreeing with you, I might say really, you know. But if I don't believe you, I might say really. Now, you know, if that gets kind of copied over, written down, and translated through several languages over the course of a couple thousand years, how do we know? How do we really know what the speaker meant? You know, this far removed. I'll give you an example. One of our grandsons is studying Shakespeare in English, and Lori wanted to be helpful, so she watched a movie, found a Romeo and Juliet on the internet, Netflix or Amazon or something, and we sat here and we watched Romeo and Juliet. Now, mind you, I think they're just now celebrating the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. So this language is less than 400 years old. And it's the same language, supposedly, that we speak today. It's English. It's not translated from something else. It's the English language of 400 years ago. And yet if we listen to the Shakespearean actors who I assume are trying to deliver the dialogue in the manner that it was delivered 400 years ago, it's darn near impossible to understand what it is that they're trying to say. At least for me, it is. Now this is the English language, only 400 years old. Can you imagine what happens when we try to go into a totally different culture, a totally different mindset, a totally different way of living and of thinking, and we try to take words out of that language, and we try to bring them over into our culture and to understand them and to take them literally, you know, to read them and say, oh well, whatever that means to me today, that must be what it meant 2,000 years ago in that culture. And of course it doesn't. if you want to have fun sometime, depending on how bored you are and what your definition of fun is, uh, go to Google Translate. You know, it's a little program on the internet, and you can take a paragraph or a couple of sentences from one language, and you can plug it into a little dialog box and tell it to translate into another language. So it's very helpful to me if I'm if I'm reading something on a website that's in a foreign language. I can or reading a book that's in a foreign language. I can take a couple of sentences, I can paste it in there, and I can kind of get a rough idea, a rough sense of what it is that that the author was trying to say. But it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, and sometimes it's humorous. You know, one time I was trying to translate something, and you know, it was something about there was a knocking on the door, and or someone was knocking on the door, or something like that was what it actually meant, and the translator came back and said there were blows at the gate, and you know, once I finally somehow got it to the point where I understood that it meant that somebody was knocking on the door. Blows on the gate, knocking on the door, not too awful far apart, but you completely lose the context. So go to Google Translate and take a couple of sentences from anything, from a nursery rhyme, from a newspaper article, from anything, and put it in there, and then translate it several times. So translate it from, say, from English to German, and then from German to Russian, and then from Russian to Chinese, and then Chinese to Japanese, and then back to English, and compare and try to see how what you got back after 4 or 5 iterations of translation compares to what you started with. And it's just, it's just it'll make you laugh. It's just totally, you know, it loses something, like the Bill Murray movie Lost in Translation. Something gets lost in translation. So Rocco Errico, I want to give you this information in case anybody wants to follow it up. But where this work, where Rocco Errico's work came from, is that there's a part of the world that we know today as Kurdistan, and it's in the news a lot. It's the northern part of Iraq, up against the Turkish border, and the people there were the Kurds. And if you've ever seen the movie Harrison Ford and Sean Connery, and it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, but they're looking for the Holy Grail. And there's a scene where Harrison Ford comes riding his horse, and he rides into this valley, and it's like the sandstone valley, and there's this beautiful building that's just kind of carved right into the face of one of the cliffs. And you can go in, and there's rooms and everything in there. That's Kurdistan. That's the part of the world that I'm talking about. And that part of the world remained relatively unscathed or untouched by outside influences from the time of Christ until the First World War. Until World War I, you know, the people there were not exposed to outside influences. There weren't many foreigners that would come there. And their culture and their language and their customs and all of the things that they practiced up until that time were almost identical to what was practiced in Palestine 2,000 years ago, at the time when the New Testament, the teachings that would become the New Testament, at the time that they were being delivered. So there was a man who lived there named George Lamsa, Lamsa, and Lamsa came to the United States after World War I. I don't know whether it was the 20s or the 30s, but certainly by the 30s he came here. And what Lamsa realized was that the Western mind, not understanding the Semitic culture, was taking things in the Bible completely out of context, and therefore missing the point, missing the message. And he gives an example that as a newcomer to the United States, he wanted to write a letter and send a letter to somebody. And I think he was in New York, and the letter was going to California. And he asked somebody, you know, how do I do that? And they said, well, you know, you write their address on the outside of the envelope, you put a stamp up in the corner, and if you go outside on the street, there's going to be a metal bin there, and you just drop your letter into that metal bin, and the post office will come and pick it up, and they will take it and deliver it. So he did. He went down to the street and he looked around, and there was a metal bin on the corner. And on the outside of the metal bin, it said waste, W-A-S-T-E, waste. And of course, the English language was his second language. And he looked at it and he said, well, maybe that means west. And my letter's going to California. That's west. So he threw his letter in the waste bin. And later on, he realized what he had done, and he had a kind of a chuckle. But his point is that we Westerners, we try to go back and take a language that the scriptures were written in several thousand years ago, a language that we don't understand, that came from a culture that that we cannot relate to, and we try to take things literally, and we get them wrong. So Lamsa said about his work, which was to kind of teach and to write and to help people to understand the idioms in the Bible and the language of the Bible and the customs of the Bible, so that we could come to a deeper realization of what these things meant. And one of his students was Rocco Errico. Last I heard, Rocco Errico is down in Atlanta teaching at Dr. Barbara King's church down there. You can go on the internet. There's a website, Nuhra, N-O-O-H-R-A, nuhra.org, and in Aramaic, Nuhra means light. Let there be light, which really means let there be enlightenment or wisdom. So anyway, Rocco Errico kind of carried on the work of Dr. Lamsa, and this book that we're working from today is called Setting a Trap for God, Setting a Trap for God. And he's talking about what is prayer, what did it mean in the Aramaic culture of the time, and he's specifically using the example of what we come to know in our country as the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, which was given by Jesus in that part of the New Testament that we call the Sermon on the Mount. Right? And remember, the Sermon on the Mount is a literary device. It is a setting where they have Jesus on a hillside teaching, people sitting at his feet, which is what Upanishads means, the teachings learned at the master's feet. And the Sermon on the Mount is generally a summation of what Jesus taught. So there was probably never a time where all of this happened in one place at one time, but it's kind of like an author writing a story. Sometimes you're writing a story, and what you do is you take the characteristics of several different characters, or you take the characteristics of several different events that occurred over time, and you create a setting where it all seems to be happening right now. And this is what the Sermon on the Mount is. It's a summation of the teaching. So it's kind of interesting, because in this summation of the teaching of Jesus, and again, there's a difference between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching about Jesus. There's this kind of dramatic scene where the disciples say, teach us how to pray. Lord, teach us how to pray. Right? John the Baptist taught his disciples how to pray. Teach us how to pray. And of course, it's there as a literary device. It's there to give the author an opportunity to communicate to us what Jesus taught about prayer. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, why would they even put that in there? Why would that even be a question that people would ask? Obviously, human beings have been praying for as long as there have been human beings, right? In many different ways, in many different shapes, in many different cultures. So why is it important? Why is it important to even ask and answer the question? Why is it important to give us this instruction, to teach us how to pray? And perhaps it comes down to an acknowledgement that not all prayer is equal. Not all forms of prayer are equal. There's a book that I read called Prayer Can Change Your Life. And in it, the author was saying that they tried to conduct, for the time period in the 50s, they tried to conduct as much as they could a scientific experiment on the effectiveness of prayer. And of course, you hear a lot of this, today. People will talk about these studies that show that prayer helps people heal, and people who were sick and had prayer groups praying for them healed quicker than others, and these things. And in this particular book, the author raised the question and said, well, in order to even explore that, in order to even explore the idea of is prayer effective, you really have to define what you mean by prayer. And you have to ask yourself if all of the people praying are praying in the same way, and their concept is the same, and what do they mean, when they use the word prayer. And the author of this particular book came to the conclusion that the one praying, that their concept of prayer and their concept of God had more to do with the effectiveness of prayer than the number of times that people repeated prayers or the number of people that were even praying. So I often think of that when I see these little articles on the internet, that says, prayer works and all these things. Well, whose prayer? What kind of prayer? What are people thinking about prayer? And of course, that brings us to a couple more questions. And one of them is, well, what is prayer, and how does it work? What is the benefit of prayer? And then, of course, how do we do it? How do we do it? So, Dr. Errico tells us if we look at the word for prayer in Aramaic, it's not necessarily what we in our culture today, what we think prayer might mean. Right? Remember, we learn the use of words from the context when we're growing up. People something's going on and people use a word, and we associate that word with that context. And it may be years before we recognize that there's in fact another context, a different way of using the word that is just as accurate. It's just as acceptable to use the word in this context as in that context. But the original way that we learn the word tends to be the one that stays with us. So a lot of times our idea of prayer is somehow asking or begging God to do something for us. A lot of times as kids growing up, and you see it even today, when something that people consider to be wrong or terrible happens, earthquakes and fires and floods and plane crashes and all those things, one of the first responses or first reactions of people is well, keep the victims in your prayer. Keep these people in your prayers. So we kind of get the idea as children growing up that prayer is something that you do when something goes wrong. And prayer is somehow asking God to intercede, to undo something in that God has done. So our society is kind of a little bit confused, if you want to think of it that way. God sends disaster to people, but then we pray to God to ease their burden. Well, if God was going to ease their burden, why did God send the disaster to them in the first place? God sends sickness to people, and then we say, well, please take the sickness away. So our idea in our culture is that somehow what we're doing in prayers is we are kind of whittling away God's will. We are through repetition, through repeating the same words over and over and over again, that somehow we are influencing or even manipulating, if you will, the spiritual power of the universe, the spiritual force that might be called God, and we're getting it to do something that it originally didn't want to do. Now, if you study theology, there's all kinds of explanations as to why that might be. God sent that trouble to cause us to awaken, and because we awakened, the trouble was taken away from us. All of those kind of things. If you look at Old Testament theology, you look at what we call the Hebrew Bible. Kind of the theme that runs through that is that people understood what it was that God wanted them to do, or how they were supposed to go about their business, and they didn't do that. And because they didn't do that, they brought the calamity to themselves. And the prophet would arise and say, hey, you brought this upon yourself because you strayed away from the covenant. You didn't do what you said you would do. And if you go back to doing what you said you will do, well, the trouble will go away. Now, I think today, for those of us in New Thought, we can kind of look at that and say, yeah, I can relate to that. We understand that we're supposed to keep our consciousness attuned to God. We understand that we're supposed to dwell on what we want and keep our mind up for what we don't want. That we're supposed to bless everyone and everything and express gratitude as we go through life. And we don't always do that. Sometimes we forget to do that. Sometimes we get busy. Sometimes, for whatever reason, we just don't. And we stop consciously paying attention to what's going on in our life. We stop consciously co-creating the experience that we wish to have in our lives. We fall into the law of averages. Stuff happens, and then we go back and say, well, perhaps I need to go back and I need to get back into my spiritual practice. So that kind of, to me, that kind of relates to the idea that I get when looking at the Old Testament. But definitely in our culture today, if you look around at what people are doing when they're praying, or if you ask them how prayer works. I saw a news interview one time. The news was interviewing a young man who's about 16, and his little sister had some type of horrendous, incurable disease, and it went away. It just went into remission, and the family attributed that to the power of prayer. And one of the news anchors, or one of the news reporters, asked this young man, well, how did that work? And he said, he says, there's saints in heaven, and these saints, they have an in with God, and we asked that saint to go ask God to do us a favor, and they did, and that's why my sister is better today. And I'm not mocking the young man. I'm not picking on him. He was very, very sincere that was his understanding of prayer and of faith and how it worked. And I think that kind of exemplifies a lot of what we see in our culture today. So Rocco Errico asks us, and I think we all need to ask ourselves, well, what is prayer? What is the purpose of prayer? Why should we even do it? And if we do it, how do we do it? So our common definition of prayer is either we're praying to God when something goes wrong, and we're asking God to undo whatever it is that God let happen, trying to work our way out of trouble, or as Rocco Errico tells us, sometimes we get into a more optimistic place in our life, and we think, well, God is just a big vending machine, and if we pray properly, then God is going to give us houses and cars and money and all kinds of good things, because we have figured out the effective way to pray. It's kind of like learning the secret word, and we can say the secret word, and God will do all this stuff for us. And we need to drop both of those ideas. We need to kind of put those off to the side. We need to stop for a minute and ask ourselves, what are we? And what is this thing called prayer? And when I say what are we, I think we have to come back past this idea of the physical, because the physical is not what we are. Right? The physical is a way that we express ourselves, but it is not what we are. It is not who we are. And we need to bring ourselves back past this idea of the mental, the intellectual, logic and reason. Yes, we use logic and reason. We analyze things. We figure things out. We know how to solve math problems. We can do all those things, but that's not who we are. That's not what we are. Again, that is a way that we express ourselves. So if we walk back past, beyond thought, but where thought comes from, beyond words, but where words come from, beyond the physical, but where the physical comes from, We recognize that we are consciousness. We are consciousness. Simply awareness. We are awareness. God is. God is aware. And in learning how to meditate, we learn how to experience ourselves as consciousness. We learn how to get into that awareness. Most of the day our mind is flitting from here to there with the things that we need to do just to make a living. But when we take that time, in this section of the New Testament, Jesus told the disciples, he said, go in secret, go in quiet. Take a little quiet time to go pray. Don't stand out on the street corner and pray so everybody can see you. That's not going to do you any good. You need to take time. You need to take time. In fact, Dr. Errico tells us that one of the definitions of prayer in Aramaic is attentive awareness, being alert, listening to the divine inspiration and guidance within. So if we come back to this point, if we can recognize that we are not the body and we are not the mind, we are not the mind's creation of the ego, but we are consciousness, the perfect meditation is pure consciousness aware of itself. Pure consciousness aware of itself. So we learn how to meditate, we have objects, we focus on our breath, we focus on candles, we have something that we need to tune our consciousness toward. But there's a state of meditation where pure consciousness is simply aware of itself. So what we are is consciousness. That's what we are, pure consciousness. And there's only one consciousness, that is the consciousness of God, and it is expressing itself as us, as our consciousness. And as we come to recognize that, then we have to ask, well, what is this purpose in life? What are we here for? And as Goldsmith tells us, we are consciousness unfolding. We are consciousness becoming more aware of itself as us. We are consciousness unfolding. Now, yes, we have physical experiences, and yes, we have mental experiences, and yes, we have emotional experiences. But the essence of what we are is we are consciousness unfolding, consciousness unfolding. And we are growing in consciousness to the degree that we put our time and our attention into our spiritual practice. We can go through an entire lifetime and not grow a bit. We can go through an entire lifetime and continue to do everything exactly the same way that we learned it when we were kids. And there's absolutely no growth. There's a lot of activity, but there's no growth. We just keep doing the same thing over and over again, maybe in slightly different ways. But our real purpose is to grow in consciousness. And this is where the importance of prayer comes in. What is it that changes consciousness? You can change the body by doing exercise and the way that you eat. You can change the mind by studying and learning, and practicing new fields, music, engineering, those sorts of things. But what is it that changes consciousness? And it is prayer that changes consciousness. I think it's Emmett Fox who tells us that prayer is the only thing that changes consciousness. And we ask ourselves then, well, how does prayer do this? Is there something magical about the words that we use? Is it particular words? And the answer to that, of course, is no. The way that prayer changes consciousness is that the spiritual practice, the act of praying, opens us up to the experience of God, to the presence of God, to the activity of God. And it is that divine contact, it is that, Ernest Holmes calls it, our conscious awareness of the divine contact. It is that divine contact that produces the changes in our consciousness. So prayer is not for the purpose of begging God to take some kind of trouble away for the trouble that we usually got ourselves into. Oh God, take this away from me. Nor is prayer for the purpose of going to God to give us a better human life, give us more stuff. The prayer says, lead us not into materialism, and we want to pray, but give us more materialism. Give me a better car and a better house. It's not for that at all. The purpose of prayer is for us to attune ourselves into the conscious awareness of the presence of God. So Dr. Errico tells us to think of prayer, and one of the definitions of the word in the Aramaic that is used for prayer is attunement and attunement. Another definition is setting a trap. So what we are doing when we are praying is we are attuning our consciousness so that we can set a trap, that we can capture, or that we can receive the presence and the activity of God that is already there, that is already within us, that is already around us, that is already through us. So you probably remember Ray Stevens had a hit song with an old gospel song called Turn Your Radio On. Turn your radio on and listen to the music in the air. And the idea of that song, which was written in the early part of the 20th century, Ray didn't write it, he recorded it, is that Spirit, God, is constantly active in us, around us, and through us. But unless we attune ourselves to it, unless we tune into it, unless we set that trap, as the Aramaic culture would say, we miss it. We miss it because we're busy, because we're doing all kinds of other things, because our minds are preoccupied with making a living or raising a family or all of the other things that we have to do. And there's another attunement. You see, there's another way that we can come back and we can think about this thing called life. And it is really kind of making our life a prayer. But we, in our culture, we go through life as if our physical life and the things that we need to do to live are completely separate from our spiritual life and our spiritual practice. I've heard people say, we have to live until you die. And what they were meaning by that is well, when you die, you become spiritual. When you die, you go to heaven and you see God. But until then, you've got to figure out how to make a living. And in figuring out how to make a living, sometimes you have to do things that aren't very spiritual. You may have to cheat a little bit. You may have to take advantage a little bit. All these kind of things. So people were trying to explain away their human activity because it's separated from, it's different than the spiritual activity. And one of the things that the act of praying does, the attunement, right, is it unites us with our spirituality. Right? So in the example of the New Testament, the people said to Jesus, they said, teach us how to pray. Teach us how to pray. And Jesus didn't say, use these words. He said, pray like this, in this manner, in this format, in this methodology. And of course, we have taken that to say we have to use those specific words that are written down. We have to repeat those. And that's good as far as it goes. But without the feeling, without the awareness, the words mean nothing. The words are empty words. So in this methodology that Jesus gave the people at the time, he started off by acknowledging what God is and what our relationship to God is. And he used the word, an informal word, Abba, which kind of means Papa or Daddy. Now we have to make clear that we're not being sexist. God is not a male deity. But the word that he chose was not a formal word. It was an intimate word. So you can imagine You can imagine as a child crawling up on your parent's lap and saying mommy or daddy. And it's very intimate and it's very loving and it connotates a relationship, a close relationship. So the word that was chosen, it actually can be translated, O universal spirit which is everywhere present. Daddy, mommy, O universal spirit which is everywhere present. This loving spirit, this loving consciousness, this loving awareness that is everywhere present. And our relationship with it is so close, it is so intimate, that probably the best human example that we can have is of a child and a loving parent. This unconditional love. So it's very important as we go through this that we're talking about this feeling, not the words, but the feeling. Can we develop this feeling? And this is the first step in spiritual mind treatment. Can we develop the feeling that God is and God is perfect? And use whatever word you want. Some people don't like the word God. Some people don't like the word Father. I couldn't use the word Father for many years. I used the word grandfather because that reminded me of unconditional love. But can we bring ourselves into this feeling that the love and the presence of God is everywhere? Right? And this is who art in heaven. Heaven meant counsel. Heaven meant peace. Heaven meant harmony. You know, this universal spirit everywhere present is already in perfect harmony. It counsels us and it guides us and it loves us. And we are attuning ourselves to that. We are bringing ourselves into a conscious awareness of that. So then this thing called God is not an abstract idea of some sentient being out there somewhere far away. But it is nearer than our hands and feet. It is closer than our breath. It is the reason that we even have life. It is the reason that the sun shines and the wind blows. An intimate feeling of this loving presence that we are attuning ourselves to. And as we start to attune ourselves to it, we recognize, thy will be done. Thy will be done. We recognize that its will for us must be good. Not to punish us, not to trick us, not to test us, not to send us and condemn us for eternity, but constantly forgiving, constantly overlooking. In fact, it's not even aware of our mistakes, you know. And the examples we're given in scriptures is that we as human beings, with all of our mistakes, with all of our frailties, with all of our errors, we look after our children. Remember, there's a passage that says, who, if the child asks for a piece of fish, would we give it a snake, or a piece of bread, would we give it a stone? And again, we don't get that here. We don't understand that. But in the Middle East, the bread was flat bread, you know, like matzah or like pita bread or taco bread. And the way that they stacked it when they lived in the tents was they put flat stones over it. So they put layer of bread, layer of stone, layer of bread, layer of stone. And the fish was dried fish, smoked fish that was put into a jar, a pottery jar, and sometimes the little snakes would crawl in there. So if a child woke up in the middle of the night and the parent wanted to give it something, you know, to comfort it, some comfort food, a piece of bread or a piece of fish, the parent would make sure that in the dark they were getting bread and not a piece of flat stone, and that they were getting fish and not a lizard or a snake that had crawled into the jar. So we as human beings, even with all of our weaknesses, we generally tend to try and take care of our children. And how much more so is this loving spirit, O universal spirit everywhere present, that is trying to take care of us. So we then come to recognize that everything that we need, everything, not just the bread, but the bread stands for everything we need, right? That everything that we need has already been provided, and it was provided for us a long time before we got here. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the money that we need, the houses, all the ideas, the inspiration, everything was provided for us. But we have to accept it. We have to attune ourselves to it. We have to open ourselves up. So we accept this day, our daily bread, everything that we need, everything that's appropriate for this day has been given, and we accept it, but we recognize that God is the source. I don't want to eat the bread that I got by the sweat of my brow. In other words, I don't want to say, hey, look what I did here. Look at this. Look at the salary I make here. Look at what I did. But to recognize that every meal that we eat is a gift from God, to attune ourselves to that. And then we come to, forgiveness. We hold on so much as human beings. We hold on to the past. Usually we hold on to the wrongs that we think somebody else did to us while forgiving ourselves by ignoring the wrong that we did to somebody else. But we have to recognize that the divine doesn't hold anything against us. It never could, and it never will. It knows us only as it knows itself. Dr. Holmes tells us that if we look at the parable of the prodigal son returns home and he's beating himself up and he's muttering all the way about what a fool he's been, taking his inheritance and squandering it, and now he's going home begging his father for a servant's job. And the father comes out to greet him, and the son says, I'm a terrible fool. I've erred. I've just made terrible mistakes. I'm a terrible person. And the father said, you're home. Let's get you cleaned up. Let's celebrate. The father never acknowledged the mistakes. So we bring ourselves into this feeling that the divine doesn't hold anything against us. Why should we hold anything against anyone else? Why should we hold anything against ourselves? We are all in this process of growing consciousness, you see. We're all doing the best we can with the consciousness we have at the time. So let's not hold anything against one another, because we're really just holding it against ourselves. If I refuse to forgive you for something that happened 20 years ago, I'm not doing anything to you. Maybe denying you the pleasure of my company, which you probably appreciate that fact. No, I'm doing something to myself. I'm holding myself back. So what we want to come to then is this realization that when people came to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and they said, teach us how to pray, this was an opportunity to show us something that was different. It was different than asking, pleading, begging, or beseeching. It was different than trying to manipulate. It was different than seeing ourselves as separate from a God way, way, way far away out there somewhere in this thing called heaven, but heaven rather being peace and harmony, heaven being with us here. Remember, there are other places in the New Testament where Jesus was asked, where is the kingdom? And he said, it's here, it's now, it's right here, but people don't see it. Go within and find the kingdom. So he wasn't talking about a physical place. He was talking about a place in consciousness, a place in consciousness. So we want to start out by recognizing that what we are doing when we are praying is we are tuning our consciousness to a good that is already there, the presence that is already there, the love that is already there, but we haven't been attuned to it. We've had our dial tuned to anger or materialism. And that's an important part of the prayer. Lead us not into temptation means lead us not into materialism. Let's not get so hung up on this idea that the material world is real and we've got to struggle to get more of it. But let's recognize that everything that is in it is a gift from God, that comes from God. Let us remember that. So what we're doing is we're starting with a recognition of what God is. God is good. It is whole, it is perfect, it is complete, it is love. It is the epitome of love. Love is the experience of oneness and unity, and since God is already one with everyone and everything, it is perfect love. And that perfect love includes us. It doesn't exclude us. We don't have to fight and claw our way into its love. As Meister Eckhart says, he never thanked God for loving him because God couldn't help it. God couldn't help it. God loves us unconditionally. We are part of that unconditional love. So we let go of anything that needs forgiveness. We forgive ourselves for our mistakes. We forgive others for our mistakes. We recognize that in the grand scheme of eternity, those things aren't even going to matter. That what matters is that we grow in consciousness. And we grow in consciousness through our spiritual practice, which opens ourselves up, which attunes us to experiencing the presence and the activity of God that is already here. The world is a mystical place. It is a mystical place where the presence of God is here, it is now, and it is available to anyone who will attune to it, who will open themselves up to it, who will experience it. So this idea is much different than what we were probably raised with. But it is really an idea that is saying that prayer is something that we can start in our secret closet, in our quiet time, within ourselves. But once it begins to take effect, remember, there's another part in the New Testament that says the kingdom of heaven is like the yeast that you put into bread. You just put a little bit in there and you mix it up, but then it starts to grow and grow and grow until it fills the whole loaf. Once we start to attune ourselves to the consciousness of God, to the presence of God, to the awareness of God, then it is something that transpires within us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is not something that only happens 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening. It is every bite of food that we eat. It is every drink that we take. It is every person whom we meet. It is every task that we perform. You know, the Shakers are just, I guess they're obsolete now. There was only a few Shakers left a few years ago, and that's because they practice celibacy. And because they kind of turned their back on the materialistic ways of the world. But the Shaker furniture, if you can still find a piece of furniture or a chair that was made by the Shakers, it's sturdy and it lasts. And their thought was that everything that they did was an expression of God, and therefore it needed to be done to the best of their ability. You know, simple idea, very simple idea. But can we get into that flow of consciousness that we recognize that everything that we do is an expression of the God within, and we need to do it to the best of our ability. So I invite you this week, explore your ideas of prayer. What is prayer? What is treatment? What is meditation? Are they all the same things? Are they different things? Or are they for the same purpose? Ask yourself if the purpose of spiritual practice is indeed for the purpose of developing a greater awareness of God, and that greater awareness of God within. And I'm talking awareness, the actual experience, the divine contact, that is what changes our consciousness. And changing our consciousness is what life is all about. And it's not about getting more stuff or bigger houses or fancier cars and all those other things that that the advertisers would like us to believe. But it is about growing in consciousness. So if we wish to grow in consciousness, then we wish to learn how to pray. We wish to go within, to take our time, to attune ourselves to the presence of God, to remain alert, and to capture, to trap the activity of the divine within. This is what changes us. This is what helps us to move forward. So I invite you to explore these ideas this week and explore your practice this week. And try to catch yourself in the act of catching God. And so it is.